right, we are live. Welcome. Hey, friends. Good afternoon, good morning, I suppose, depending on where you're located, where you're watching from. It's good to be back with you. We are here for our 23rd kitchen table conversation here with the Men and Masculine Folks Network in Minnesota. And as always, we are joined today with our friends who I will give a minute to introduce themselves here. But today we are looking forward to having a conversation. Not sure if folks have heard the news yet, but just yesterday, we learned that Bill Cosby was released from prison, and the verdict and all of that was thrown out. And so we're going to be having a conversation today about kind of, in response to that, and then what does it look like? What does it mean? And how do we navigate a situation like this where perhaps we know people within the community who have caused harm, who are perhaps continuing to cause that harm and are not, and have not been open to being held accountable by people within the community. And so how do we move in and out of situations when we know those folks are still around actively harming people that we care about in community? And so I'm personally looking forward to this conversation. I know people who have caused harm here in our community. And so just kind of digging in a little bit to, how we think about this, how we can feel about it, and then what it actually looks like to continue building a strong and safe community while these folks are in and around us. So before we jump too much further into that, I'd love to have my friends here take a minute to introduce yourselves, and then we can get started.
All right, I'm Roderic in Minneapolis. He, him. Glad to be here.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Felix Martinez. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I'm reporting from Eagan, Minnesota. Super happy to be here too.
Pheng, he, him, his, and I am actually in Wisconsin this week. So that is where I am. I was going to say teleporting from. It feels like that these days.
Oh, that's awesome. Like a portal. And I am Sean. I realized I didn't say that in the beginning. My name's Sean, and my pronouns are he, him, and his, and I am coming to you live from Duluth, Minnesota, where it is a really nice day, a little bit cooler than it has been. A nice breeze happening. So and as always, we have behind the scenes our dear friend Austin, who's helping out with moderating the conversations within the chat for those of you who are watching live. So we encourage you to ask your questions, to share your comments and thoughts as we're having this conversation together. We think it's really important to have these conversations and to include you in that portion of it. So those of you who are watching live, we'd love to hear from you and to hear how you navigate these kinds of situations. What are you thinking and feeling, hearing the news that Cosby was released? And yeah, we'd love to hear from you. So thanks to Austin for doing that in the behind the scenes. We appreciate you. And so, I can sort of start us off here a little bit. I heard the news late last night, and I was sort of shocked. And so I, had started my Googling to kind of learn a little bit more. And one of the first things I came across actually was an article that was actually like one of the survivors' response to him being released. And so listening to her share just like the shock, being stunned, and just like the lack of justice, I can't imagine what that feels like. And yeah, just it got me thinking about how often this thing happens this way, where men and masculine identifying people are often perpetrating harm, and then, you know, our criminal justice system really is not designed and really doesn't work very well in service to victims and survivors of that violence. And so, um, you know, I personally know many people who have been impacted by violence, and they never actually do report it to the police, and then they, my cat is joining, and then they, you know, and then they have to like move in community with these people who have never been held accountable, who, um, you know, most likely are continuing that same harmful behavior. And so, um, those are just some of my first thoughts and questions that came to mind. You know, it's like, how do we do this together when we know that the harm is happening, and those folks are not willing to be held accountable or don't see the harm as being harmful? And so I'd love to hear what you all, as you're watching, are thinking about this topic, and from my siblings here as well.
I think about, you know, to what you were sharing, Sean, I think about what comes to my mind first, I should say, is privilege, the platform that he has, right, as an actor and a star and having some fame. And even if he was in prison, I think he would still get some accommodations, right, that maybe perhaps other people may not get, because he's surrounded by luxury in some ways. And so there might be a very luxurious prison time as well too. I think about somebody a while back, they were talking about, when was it Paris Hilton or somebody who had gone to jail for a couple of days, and people were like, yeah, we had the best food and it was like really nice, you know. And so even that, I think that even that in itself, in the incarceration portion of it, is like there's no sort of way for him to do any like remorseful thinking, perhaps. I don't know, maybe he has done some, um but there's no like accountability piece to it, right, where he then can say fully be responsible. And I think, Felix, you shared earlier on too that um he may have, it didn't seem like he was um forthcoming or saying that he was responsible for any of it, right? Denying many of the sexual violence that actually he had caused. And so I think about like now him being in community, similar to other people and other men that I have known, or other folks who cause sexual violence in community and have stayed in community, and then nobody has really actually like held them accountable. And I think we all know people like that in our own lives as well too, in some ways. I think what's different for him obviously is his stature, right? It's his stature, it's his access to resources, it's his access to live comfortably, unlike those people who we know in community who've caused harm. So I think a strategy that we've always thought about is like, how do you sort of like um, draw boundaries and help each other in community draw boundaries? And I think about that in terms of how communities have done that. To your question about like, how do we, if people don't want to be accountable and don't want to be taking responsibility, how does community, particularly men and masculine folks, step in and really then sort of like keep communities safe, right? And by that I mean like not as protectors, but as sort of holding a container. That's sort of what I'm thinking about, like, or holding space for people and being watchful, being attentive, right, in community. And again, not in ways where it's about protecting, but it's about them learning to navigate the violence, right? And shielding, perhaps maybe shielding, I don't know, shielding others from the harm that could be happening, right? And he was surrounded. I saw some video clips. They were talking, and he was surrounded by a lot of folks as he was coming out, and it looked like he was fragile and old, but it still doesn't make what he did right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a hard part when we try to shield and protect our community in situations like this, when we're at the same time we're trying to build resiliency and strength. It's tough. It's really tough. Because you want to be sure those voices are listened and they're respected. We're talking in the Cosby situation about 58 victims, survivors, and seeing him getting out of jail. How you feel, if you're in their situation, it's horrible. It's also horrible for the youth. Us as an adult, we're not being able to handle these situations, and what we telling the youth, we're leaving all that weight to them, just because we haven't been able to deal and control and create systems that don't allow this situation to happen. So it's tough, especially then I have a conversation with my daughters and let her know, you're strong enough, you go out, have fun, when in the reality, we know there are individuals like him that's still outside just because the system haven't been able to deal with them properly. So yeah, really, really tough. The more I think, the more confused I get, about the situation, what we're doing wrong, what we need to do in order to prevent of these situations to happen, because we have amazing organizations, amazing advocates, individuals working out there. What we're doing wrong, that's the only thing that came to my mind. So.
I was shocked and appalled. But I also think there's this sense of, I like the use of the word container, because I think it seems to me that you want to nurture folks past those habits, even as they may not, and nurture may be the wrong word, but it's the word that comes to mind, as they may not want to accept responsibility. Because in my mind, I think that you may not accept responsibility today, but eventually, if I keep saying, if in our encounters with you, if I can keep conveying to you that that we know what you do and that it's not right, but we're here for you, then perhaps that both will contain, if you will, the other harmful actions that may be perpetrated on other folks. And at the same time, cause a person to understand or that you question what they've done. So when they see you, it's a reminder of, we've got something unresolved. So, because I think that sometimes we say, well, I talked to so-and-so and they just don't want to talk about it anymore. And everyone kind of lets it go for the peace. And in fact, it doesn't give anyone any more peace, nor justice. And so I like the idea of, at least when I think of the term container, having this notion that this is a relationship and an action that has some ongoing negotiation that's going to happen. Not that needs to happen, but that's going to happen. And it's, I think, in our responsibility to maintain that, again, without, we don't want to further damage someone.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Roderic. I think that you were sharing there and talking, what comes to mind for me is that to the question of like, how do we do responsibility and accountability with somebody who isn't willing to engage in that kind of community building, I should say. There's actually no right way to do it. And I think it's important that we as men and masculine folks actually understand that there's no right way to do it, right? And that there's also no wrong way to do it either. And that we're willing to actually like nurture, to your point there, Roderic, nurture one another through that process, in that process of building and deepening our own relationships with each other as we try to build community and build boundaries in community around navigating the violence, around navigating safety, and creating measures and mechanisms that allow for us to be in community still with one another, right? Because what I've seen often is where we, for example, like the 4 or 5 of us who are the ones who are actually creating and holding the container, become contentious with one another and really are rifling with one another about what the process should be, right? Whereas some may be like, we should really do all the shame, and some are like, to Roger's point there, saying we should do this very nurturing way, right? And then we become like stuck in the processing of it, or that becomes the tensions point for how we break community, right? And I think that it's important to acknowledge that there is actually no right way to do it. And in fact, we should try all of it to see what will work to actually do the nurturing and engaging of this individual who has actually caused harm, to see what approach actually would work for him or with that person. So I just wanted to say that and share that what's important is the struggle with one another and the nurturing of one another in the relationships for those who are actually in community together, trying to build community and wanting to engage a person who doesn't want to engage them, right?
You know that, but as you were talking, I was thinking about like a wrestling match as a sort of metaphor, right? When you're wrestling with someone, you know, you were consistently sort of countering their move. And they're mindful that you're going to be countering their moves. And so that's the visual that came to me as you were talking about that. And I like, there's no one way to win, right? And I believe that, yes, that fear of doing it wrong really has hurt us. And I think when people who've been hurt ask us, why aren't you doing anything? You know, our answer can't be, I'm not sure what the right thing is, right? Or I don't want to do it wrong. It has to be a response that is nurturing to them also. And that I think signals that a commitment to end that happening, to prevent that happening to them from that person again.
I agree with you so much there about particularly the notion of when you were talking about like, let's just not talk about it anymore or engage because that person doesn't want to engage. And I think what's seeping into that like, let's just keep the peace, is that is already how men and masculine folks organize with one another, right? It's like, we did the best we could. He's not going to take it. So it's all on you now, right? The survivors, to Rogeric's point there, in a not nurturing way at all, like throwing it back on them to say, you then all deal with it, or you all just like be okay that this is this is just how it is, and nothing is going to happen, right? Because we just want to keep the peace and we want to make sure that everybody's okay. But part of that is the privilege that we as men and masculine folks have in perpetrating, quote unquote, that violence and allowing for that violence to continue is when we say we just want to keep the peace. And he's not wanting to engage. We've tried the best that we could, and we can't do anything about it anymore, right? But in fact, it's really about that struggle to keep engaging and to keep moving and to keep talking to that person, regardless of whether that person wants to engage or not, and no matter how tiresome it is. I think that that's the role, and that is the deconstructing of the violence that we have to actually do, and understanding that the person is not made violently, but they have the choices to make violence, right? So being able to separate that and to be able to see that nurturing piece in that person as well, to nurture that. So I wanted to share that piece because I think oftentimes, at least like I've seen in the home community, where a lot of the men and elder men who make decisions are like, we've told him enough to stop abusing you, right? And he's not listening anymore. And so now all of a sudden they turn to her and blame her for staying in the relationship, right? Well, we told you to leave the relationship. We told you to stop acting these ways, and you don't too. And that's why he keeps beating you up, you know, and abusing you and whatever. So we don't know what to say to the two of you anymore. So it becomes like this mutual combative domestic violence, but it's actually not mutual. But time and again, they have talked to this couple so many times in domestic violence situations in the home community. And then people get tired, right? People get tired and they're exhausted and they're like, we don't want to engage. So therefore, it is up to you, survivor, the one who's experiencing the harm, whether you're going to stay in the relationship or not, because we're no longer going to talk to him or you anymore about this violence because you two aren't changing and he's not willing to change in any way, right? And so he gets off the hook. And so I think about those situations as well. And with regards to this is like that no matter how tiring and how exhausted we may be as those who are trying to build community, engage each other and engage the person who's doing the harming, that we have to keep pedaling and we have to pace ourselves in that marathon, quote unquote, and not exhaust one another out or take the easy way out of like, we've done all we could do, we can't do any more, right? And I think that at times the criminal justice system functions like that, right? We've done the best we could, but you've seen people who've gone to the criminal justice system who caused harm time and again, over and over and over, and the system is just like, we don't know what to do with the person anymore, right? And then they don't so I just think about that part as well too.
I think that's interesting, the keeping the peace part. And for me, I think, I was thinking about, well, I think another way that we show up in these types of situations is, at least, from my personal experience, is, we have a couple conversations with that person and they're not willing to open up. They're not willing to say, oh, yes, I see how I've caused this harm to people. And then it's like, there's a cutoff, for me. I can think of, I had a good friend who caused a lot of harm and I had no idea. And then when it came out in the community, it was sort of like, people kind of wanted me to just like kind of cut him off and sort of distance myself from him too. So it's like this tricky thing of, how do we hold both of those truths? How do we like really honor and, like you're saying, Pheng, shield and help, like actually be supportive to the survivors in the community, while also thinking about like this person, as you said, like we are not violent in nature. We like make those choices or we learn these behaviors. And so how do you continue to hold the belief that people can change and can transform, and yet, if they're not actively doing that, like how do we continue to have a relationship you know, and thinking of my, you know, my experience, it's like I haven't spoken with this person kind of since all of that happened. And I've reached out here and there, and there's no contact. And yet I know he's still, you know, people are interacting with him. People see him out and about, and it's uncomfortable and it makes people feel unsafe. And so it's like, what does it actually look like on the day to day? How do you reconnect with a person, you know, who has sort of been cut off, and how do you sort of start having conversations about that again without like it just bringing back all of the pain and the trauma and the hurt that people have felt and experienced. And it's sort of, I remember a good friend of mine said around the time that, you know, just because people have come out and shared this truth here doesn't necessarily mean that he couldn't just up and leave and go somewhere else and continue to cause that same harm in another community. So how do we move and have conversations in a way where, you know, we're thinking about that prevention of the future harm? Like we don't want it to keep happening. And I think that the people who use that violence too, I think it's so harmful to themselves as well. And there's just like, I don't know, it's such a nuanced, complex thing, right? And thinking about folks within queer and trans communities, it's like there's no faith, there's no belief in the system, in police, in the courts, you know, to have our back in that way. And so it's like, yeah, we're just sort of like left to navigate it. Like, what do you think? You know, how do you think we should, you know, what do we do now? It's been several years. Now what? You know, and I think what you said there, Pheng, too, about like there is no right way, there is no wrong way. But I think for me, thinking about that like wrong way is like, how do I cause the least amount of harm in how I'm moving? Because that would feel wrong to me, you know, to like do something to reach out to try to you know, nurture, as you're saying, Roderic, and yet that could easily be causing pain to these survivors who I also care about and don't want to cause that.
I think that what it is to know we have to actually see it through and experience it through. Right? It's sort of like what comes to the image that comes to my mind is like when people walk over charcoal, or you know, those walking on the fire or whatever. Like you have to actually walk through it, and you have to actually like pace yourself in doing that, because what you're doing is like what you're saying, Sean, is like we're holding in this container the tension point of the struggle of those who experience the harm and the person who's causing the harm, right, and doing the harming, who doesn't want to actually be accountable. And those can be very contentious points, and yet at the same time, I also believe that for those who have caused or experienced the harm, that they get the full support that they need for sure, and in a very nurturing way. And so I don't want to dismiss that part. And it's also important for them to also acknowledge that they may not be the ones who are going to want to be doing the engaging, right? And that they also have to sort of allow for others to do that engagement, right? And not sort of like, I read somewhere when you were talking, Sean, about don't recruit other people in your hate, right? Just because you don't like somebody, don't recruit others. And so I think about that at times where people who have experienced so much harm that now they're wanting to recruit others. And so now they're now enacting that harm, right? By recruiting others to now hate that individual. And there's nothing wrong with that, but what is wrong in that is like now causing more damage in the community, right? Where we then can't be nurturing of our relationships and to one another, right? And so it's a contentious and navigating point.
And yet I think it's something that can be done, and we should just move through it and move in it. And there's with some caution, obviously, right? And the caution is really around how do we move in ways where, like to what you were saying, Sean, where we are causing less harm and not more.
I think we live in communities, society that play the hot potato game. Every time we going through a struggle, we just push it to another person, and that person push it to another. So nobody want to deal with it, just because, like Roderic say, we're scared of not making the right decision. We live in this world with this many expectations of how we're supposed to behave, how we need to deal with things, and it comes to that, like Pheng said, there's not a right way or a good way or a bad way. But we need to start making those decisions and making those individuals accountable. And I understand, our criminal justice system, they're supposed to rehabilitate also, that work from that part to rehabilitate those individuals that are causing harm. But it's a community too that we need to, once, these people come out, they pay their justice, or their whatever they did wrong, that we can build a system where that people is supported and is being accountable for it. But it's tough, it's tough when you see people that causing that much harm, especially if it happens to a loved one. How you can forgive a person that caused so much harm to you or an individual that you love. It's hard, to control that hate, maybe, or that fear, that pain that's inside of you. And the only way to do it is through our community, to build in those spaces so we have these type of conversations. But yeah, I think that fear of making the wrong decision affects us in all aspects of life, just to be that perfect person. And we're not, we're humans, and we're better than that.
I think there's also a need to be, to your point, Sean, is how we have conversations with victims about the need to for corrective intervention is not the right term, because this is post. I'm thinking post anyway, but there is an aspect of that. It is, yes, I am reaching out to nurture and to heal, right? But in a context that lets survivors know that this is not an affirmation of what's been done, or I think probably even more importantly, or forgiving, if you will, or forgetting, or minimizing, but it is a sort of a procedural relationship that requires, for the health of the next person, and I think that's important, that requires an intervention. Because I do think that people, one of the things I think that is true, I think, is that most people who are victims of some of this don't want someone else to experience it. And that being a part of the conversation about why I'm going to reach out could be useful, because it begins to seem like it feels like it puts greater utility in and self-accountability, right? So I'm reaching out, but I'm also sort of in this process as a learning how to engage a perpetrator, as being one of part of many perpetrators that we will meet in our lifetime. So it's almost like you're kind of building sort of your norms, if you will, or your muscle. You're building your muscle to do this when you do that. And that maybe is one way you can talk to someone about the need to do it.
Yeah, something to think about is how sometimes the communities put all that on the church, that trust and religion, and the expectation of, that God will provide us and help give us the strength to go through things like that, and how sometimes we put all that pressure in the church when we have seen many cases of priests that have abuse from victims, and what they do, they just move from one state to another, from one country to another. So obviously they don't know how to handle that too. So the aspect of religion and faith is something that needs to be talked, because a lot of people trust and believe in that, and I'm a Catholic, I believe in God, but I've been in situations that I'm not gonna deny that I know that the church not taking the right decisions. They just avoiding, just because they know communities tend to forget, So we're talking right now about obviously this situation, but maybe in 2 weeks nobody's gonna remember, about those 58 victims and Cosby and what he did, just because maybe something else is gonna happen. So yeah.
Yeah,
I think
just,
go ahead, Sean.
oh, thanks. I was just gonna share that I had just been listening to some NPR news. I think it was just like a week or two ago that they had the Southern Baptist General Conference, like big annual thing down in the South, and that was like one of the main issues was around sexual assault and sexual violence happening within the church. And yeah, it's like we want to like place our faith in the other person or the other thing to like take care of it or to handle it, because we don't know what the heck we're doing, or it's just easier to like as has been said, it's easier to just forget it. It's easier to just put our heads back in the sand and not have to actually do any work. And I was also thinking about like the piece around, like, in this situation with Cosby, and we're talking about people causing actual physical, violence and sexual violence, but the levels, there's like degrees of harm, right, that I cause every day, like in the way that I talk to people or the way that I make jokes, or like, and it's like in those situations, it's like that's the practice right there. Like as you were saying, Roderic, it's like building that muscle of like, hey, that's not cool, or like calling out that stuff, but in a way where it is coming from like a nurturing, like, if my buddy says something gross and I actually call him out, it's because I care about him. It's because I care about all the people he's going to interact with from that moment on. It's making me think about when I first started dating my wife. I don't even know what the context was, but I made some joke about rape, or like I was like, oh, that thing raped me, or something. Just, it's hard to even say that right now. But in that moment, it was like I had been around people, and it was like that was just this term that people threw around and just sort of used in that way and in this joking manner, or like even like kill, it kills me, or it's killing me, or things like that, where it's like, actually, no. And I remember Amy was like, do not say that. Do not use that word, and it's like, I'm so glad that she said that. I'm so glad that she told me, because it's like now, it's like I can't even imagine saying something like that. But it's like we need the people to say the things to us, and we need to be in a place where we can actually like accept that and like allow it to change how we show up every day, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with you, Sean, there, and I wanted to piggyback off of what Felix shared there with regards to faith. I think there's nothing wrong in putting whatever happened in faith in terms of like moving through it, right? But you have to do the moving, right? You can't just put it on faith and then allow for faith to unwind the way that it's going to, or put it on destiny. Like in the Hmong community, we tend to put things on like, this must be faith, or this must be destined. Like I was destined to do these things. And there's like flavors and hints of that even in faith. And so I think that that's wrong if we just blindly put it on like this, it must just have been this way, you know? And I say that because there was a sexual violence cases that happened at a Hmong church in the Twin Cities. And the pastor at the congregation meeting that I attended, and I didn't attend that faith or that congregation, but I went to hear because it was my community, right? And it was the sexual violence that happened. And the pastor had said at the end, towards the end of the meeting around the sexual violence and wanting more survivors to come out if they've been harmed by this particular person in that congregation, is that he said, this might have been a test for me because he was a very new pastor to the congregation too, right? That somehow God must be testing him. And I'm like, really? Like at the end of the conversation, you come to this place where you think that God must be testing you. And I think regardless, you know, I don't know, but like to me hearing that, and as somebody who has worked on violence for so long, I'm like, but that man made those choices. And how is this how has this become a litmus test on your pastorhood, right? And as a pastor, I would suspect and expect for you to take more accountability and more responsibility for what's actually happening in the congregation, right? And talking, and the way in which they were talking and wanting survivors to come out was not very helpful either, right? And so I think that there is a responsibility there for those who are in leadership positions, and for those who have platforms like Bill Cosby, to really speak in really and really be accountable and really be responsible for the way in which they act and move, right? But when they don't, it sort of tells us in society that, oh, men just get away, particularly privileged men and masculine folks just get a slap on the wrist, and that's the end of it, right? And so I think even for those who haven't done that and who have those kinds of platforms, such as religious leaders or clan leaders that I think about in the Hmong community, they have a platform where they can garner the attention of others, and they need to be responsible in talking about the violence as well as it unfolds, right?
It makes me think of like when we're like how we screen new people we meet, new men we meet, who are in relationship with someone in our circle, you know, and the screening is kind of, are you nice to them? Do they like you? Do you listen? The screening doesn't seem to, and we do say, you know, if you hurt that person, I'll be really upset with you, but we don't really seem ever ask them how they unpack their tension, right? It seems like maybe we could have some more fundamental conversations that are about sort of what leads up to, for example, physical violence or mental violence. And I just am thinking all the other things we're worried about with this new person in this person's life, which I think are all valid, but I do think it'd be interesting to just, you know, try to get ahead of, or try to have some conversations that we might end up having later, earlier, you know, because you know how you meet people and people go, I had a funny feeling about, right? It's like, perhaps you should unpack that, right? Because a funny feeling doesn't undo harm that's been done, right? So don't sit with that funny feeling, right? Unpack it. And so Because it just hurts people's feelings when you say, I knew that person was bad. It's like,
that's reminding me and making me think about too, like how for me in my life, like when women and them identified people, non-binary people have come to me and said, I got a weird feeling about that person, or there's just something off, you know, like there have been many times where people that I care about have come and I've sort of been like, oh, well, that's just how he is, or like, you know, and just like sort of giving the pass rather than like what we're saying here is like actually think about what that is, like what is causing that person to feel that unsafe feeling, and then like I don't know, it's just like something around empathy and like, well, if it's not a big deal, you know, then it's like it doesn't have to actually warrant me taking the time to like process through that or think about ways that I might make people feel uncomfortable or you know, and so it's just like this easy out that we as men and masculine people just sort of automatically get handed that like easy out card or the easy button. I remember this commercial where it was like, do y'all remember that? There was like it's like someone's doing brain surgery and there's like this big red easy button that they can push and then it's like done magically, you know? And I just think, gosh, I don't know. We cause a lot of harm and we bring a lot of good things to community too. But I think that building the muscle of like doing the work, because women and femme folks and queer folks, like they're constantly doing the work. They're constantly thinking about, do I need to cross the street? Do I need to have a buddy go to the bathroom with me? Like all those things, right? From these very small seeming things. But it's like, that's the society that we live in that has like caused those folks to have to like live in this survival mode all the time. And we're just like, I feel like I'm just unaware most of the time to like, to those thoughts, those feelings. And I'm, yeah, working on it, I guess. So, and I know we're, you know, coming up to the end of our time and I'm curious, you know, each of your sort of final thoughts as we're trying to wrap up this. I mean, this is not a easily wrap upable conversation, and it needs to continue happening, I think, and I have lots to think about for myself. So I'm just very appreciative of each of you and like, I don't know, the real ways that each of you show up in these conversations, and it's like that's a model for me, and then like we're modeling this hopefully for other folks who are watching this and thinking, I know someone like that, or my partner said this person is creeping them out and I need to do a little bit more thinking about that. So yeah, just deeply grateful to each of you, and I know Pheng will wrap us up, but love to hear some of your closing thoughts.
I think our easy button are some of those superficial conversations, you know, where we're like, oh, let me just go check him out. Yeah, he's fine, just a little bit off, but you know, we're all off. Well, you know, that's what I think when you said easy button, I thought of the really easy, how we take it easy on each other, and how we let sort of a lack of an authentic concern or authentic questions or authentic disagreements, how we just kind of allow those so we can get moving on to the next thing. I'll continue to be shocked and appalled, and I like to use those two words, by this latest turn with Bill Cosby right now. And also hold sort of the notions of trauma and re-trauma that it is allowing to sort of reverberate around the country. as folks have to take back their relief that, you know, several years ago, that we were moving, that justice was moving forward on this front.
For me, maybe it's like Roderic, is to elevate those voices of those 58 victims and all the other ones that are struggling every day and they haven't been able to, you know, to get the strength to, you know, to get up those spaces. You know, you are listened, you are powerful, you know, you're not alone. We love you. Never think you're not enough, because you are. There's, you know, if you need help, reach for help. Don't be scared of, you know, seeing help, looking for help as a weakness. As a communities, we need to continue to build these spaces and providing strength to our community to come out to because we're better than that. So we can hear you, we can see you. We're here to support you. We're allies, and I know there's a better day tomorrow. So thank you.
I so much appreciate this conversation because it allows, I think, for each of us to dive, and myself too included in that, to dive deeply into the struggles and the tension places, both internally within ourselves and myself, and then externally with other members in community or other men folks that I'm in relationship with, and how I am in relationship with them. So I think about that, and I think that this conversation really unravels the places of, I think, where people feel, where you are butting up against harm and hurt, and that whole, I don't want to say cycle, but that whole part about like who is in the right? Who is in the right and who has to be right, and what is right, and then what is wrong. And like to Roderic's point earlier, like talking to that person doesn't mean, to the person who's causing harm doesn't mean it's affirmation or forgiving. It means that we actually have to, how do we live in nurturing ways, right? And so I really value that, and I really appreciate you bringing that to the forefront, Roderic, the nurturance, and how do we really foster that kind of a nurturance in our own lives and with the men that we're in relationship with and the masculine identified people that we're in relationship with. So really appreciating that part and taking that away with you, that regrounding of nurturance and what that means in relationship. Appreciating all of you and each one of you, the siblings that are here today in this chat, as always, Felix, Roderic, Sean, and Austin, for the tremendous amount of support behind the scenes and engaging with those who are watching us and listening to this conversation at this moment or later on. And hopefully you all get to continue these conversations in your own homes or with the men, masculine folks in your own lives as well, because these are really contentious things and we struggle, and these struggles should not be done alone and in silos or in isolation, right? But we should be struggling and speaking about these things, to Felix's point, with one another often. And so we encourage all of you to be doing that, and wherever you may be, and be holding these kinds of spaces to actually be talking these things through, rather than just hitting the easy button, or actually not doing anything and being blinded to what is actually happening in community or in your own homes or in your own lives and relationships. That said, wanting to appreciate our philanthropy partners, the Novo Foundation, Blue Cross Blue Shield, for their generous support to allow for us to continue to be able to have these kitchen table conversations and supporting the network in doing the work that we do. And again, we are here. We will be back on the 15th. We are here every other Thursday at noon. For those who are joining us or wanting to join us, we really value your engagement with us as well. So send your questions, send your comments, really talk with us, because we really want to be building this platform for all of us as men and masculine folks to engage in conversation and be in community with one another as well too. So I don't think I'm missing anything else, but we will see all of you in 2 weeks or so at the next kitchen table.